Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I just wanted to do a quick weekly wrap up of the books I've been reading this week. And it's been, again, sort of a fun one. I'm sort of recording this a little bit earlier in the week because I'm going to be away. So they're sort of in some ways shorter, but we shall see. I think what this will reveal more than anything is sort of the other various sort of reading projects and challenges I'm doing in the background, because you'll notice a theme for a few of these. Let's get started. First up, I read The Way Blood Travels by Oliver Slate-Greene. And this is a book I read sort of for a book group that I'm part of. Was just really kind of quite interested in this. So it's about 100 pages long. It's a teeny little book. But essentially it's about a young trans man as he travels through the US on a sort of bit of a road trip that's kind of, in some ways, a bit of a coming of age, kind of finding his identity as he goes. And I just thought this was a really interesting book in kind of how it flips some of these ideas of the kind of road trip novel or that kind of thing, and instead really goes into some of the ins and outs of his identity as a trans man. So a little bit about what it's like and, the people he meets along the way who sort of help him in various parts of that journey. In some cases, giving him testosterone or giving him sort of protection in various ways, but also just this sort of, it's a really quiet, understated book in many ways. It doesn't sort of scream from the rooftops. In many ways, it's just sort of about these little changes that he sees within himself, within his body, and within sort of the world around him as he travels around. And so as a result, this sort of road trip novel ends in this really sort of gentle way of him kind of slowly coming towards a final path. And with, in the midst, he's sort of dealing with family trauma and various kind of complicated aspects of what's going on in his family and with sort of past relationships, and particularly, how he sort of interacts with the family now that he's transitioned, and sort of so many things kind of going on within this. So a really quietly beautiful little book, this. Next up, for one of my reading projects, I am reading, I finished reading Solar Bones by McCormack, and this was the winner of the Goldsmiths Prize a few years back. I'm going back and reading the old winners of the prize because it's now been 10 years, and so I kind of like the neatness of 10 years of the prize and sort of all the winners. And so I thought this was just such an interesting little book. So essentially, it is all one sentence, which, various people have very different feelings about that kind of approach with books. I totally get if that's not always your thing, and I also get if Ducks Newburyport sort of burned you for life. But actually, I think it works really nicely here because the one run-on sentence has sort of line breaks. It has various other things that actually help it still feel like a normally punctuated book. So actually, it doesn't often read fully as one full sentence. And it's a very conversational, chatty kind of book in many ways. We get lots of insights into characters almost just entirely through dialogue at times. But the crux of it is we're sort of following this man at the heart of it called Marcus, who is sort of basically going back through and revisiting parts of his life to some degree. And so we get these insights into his relationship with his wife and their child, and the various things that sort of are happening all around them. And I don't want to spoil too much, although it's not sort of super plot driven. But there's something really quite powerful about that, the way that sentence just keeps building, because at times this book is incredibly breathless and there are these beautiful, beautiful, I was going to say sentences, but it is all one sentence. These beautiful, beautiful lines that just really sing and kind of come from this book. And it does that thing that's also quite interesting about books that kind of run on sentences or things like Ducks Newburyport, is you can kind of start building these little rhythms within it that then come back later, almost sort of like various parts of a song. And so there are little echoes at the beginning of this book that come back later. And it's just really quite special. It's sometimes difficult to pin down, partly because of the one sentence nature and partly because sometimes it goes off on its own little tangents. But this feels that there's something so crafted and clever about this book, and the way that it really goes into some of the beautiful bits of these relationships that these characters have, or the shocking things that happen around them, all with this kind of Irish lilt as well that I'm a complete sucker for. So yeah, such an interesting little book there. Next up, as part of a different reading project, I read Tim Winton's Dirt Music. shortlisted, as you can see at the top, for the 2002 Booker Prize. And that's also, again, part of my project of going back and reading the old shortlists, but particularly the ones that sort of have time relevance to this year, if that makes sense, in terms of neat numbers. So I did 5 years ago. I've previously filmed the 2012 one, so 10 years ago. And now I'm going to be looking at 20 years ago. And it's just this and another book, Fingersmith, to read. So finished this and really had quite a bit of a mixed reaction to it in some ways. Essentially, it's the story of a group of sort of fairly disparate characters in many ways who meet and kind of form these relationships across Western Australia. And Australia, in many ways, is just plays such a huge role in this book. It's very Australian in the sense that, which sounds so stupid to say, but like so much of the book is rooted in characters' relationships to the country around them and to its people and to various complicated aspects of Australia's history, particularly around sort of Indigenous people and various other things. So this book sort of has a kind of, it almost feels like it's sort of going for like a grand sweeping Australian epic kind of feel. And there were large parts of this that I really enjoyed in terms of the sort of evocation of place and how it really details a lot of that and how it sort of paints this landscape for these characters. I think I just sort of didn't necessarily love the characters much or kind of really get behind them a big amount. So I don't know. I think as a result, I struggled a little bit with knowing how to place it because I just sort of wanted to get back to nice descriptions of Australia, basically. But there are some really stunning moments of sort of these characters having these really in-depth conversations around a lot of what's going on around them that was really fascinating, just not necessarily always my thing. I'm in two minds because there's so much about this book that's beautiful. It's my first time reading one of his fiction books. I read a non-fiction book of his which I really enjoyed, which actually I think was about Australia, thinking about it. So maybe I just like Tim Winton talking about Australia. Yeah, I'm kind of keen to check out others of his because I do get the feeling that I would enjoy others. But I think I just got a bit lost in this one. And given that it's quite long, that wasn't always fun. But there's a lot to like about this book as well. And then on to two new releases. The first of which is Gavin McCrea with Cells, which is a memoir. And I read this book, well, I read another one of his books, Mrs. Engels, I think earlier this year, maybe last year, at some point. Time's a weird thing. And partly because Eric Carl Anderson over at the Lenton Reader absolutely loved it and was sort of singing its praises. And I fell in love with that book too. I think its language is just so gorgeous and it's just so cleverly done. And Cells, his memoir, is staggering. I loved this. I think it's incredible. I think it essentially it's the story of Gavin McCrea sort of looking back at his life and kind of as a memoir does, but particularly the relationship between him and his mother, and how the relationship between him and his mother shapes him, shaped his mother, but also shaped the rest of the family around them. Because it's clear that, you know, he's the sort of the young, sensitive boy in the family, and he grows incredibly close to his mother. But his mother also has, at times he sees his mother's love as cruel. At times he sees them as a complete unit working together and nobody else understands them. His brothers, for example, often seem to sort of resent the relationship that Gavin and his mother have because they're so close, and it almost, some of the brothers almost seem to approach it as if there's no love left over for them, but actually Gavin doesn't always see it that way. And so this book is brutal in its honesty. There are some moments where he's incredibly cruel, almost to other people. He's sort of reflecting on moments when he's been incredibly cruel to other people, in terms of things he says to his mother in the have these sort of discussions with his brother or various other things. It's a brutal book in terms of that, but it also goes into a lot of real tenderness. This relationship between him and his mother, his sort of reactions to his brother's mental ill health, his own sort of story of an HIV diagnosis. There's so much in this book that is so profound and so well done, and the sentences are just glorious. This is just so crafted and beautiful and painful in how it's written because it's just done so well. There's nothing spared. It's just this very tight, clever memoir that at times is really difficult reading because he goes to some incredibly dark places. But I think it's all the better for it. I think this is a stunning, stunning book. And I really do recommend you pick this up because I think it's a glorious one. I'm also realising, obviously, you would have on the screen had the cover of the book, which, is sort of intentionally, I think, a bit provocative. But yeah, it's a really clever and interesting and beautiful book, and I adored it. And last but not least, I read Seven Empty Houses by Samanta Schweblin, translated by Megan McDowell. And this is a set of short stories, and I have not yet read anything else by her. I think Fever Dream has been sat on my shelf for a while, and I should really get to, especially because I just hear it's incredible. And she's an author who I've been meaning to read for a while. And this was a really fun introduction to her, I think. As much as I sometimes struggle with short stories, there's something, again, that kind of connects all of these really quite interestingly. It's kind of, how to describe it? The houses mentioned in the title of this book are sort of little windows, essentially, into, not pun not intended, windows into various characters as they sort of go about their lives in these quite complicated and interesting ways that are often quite almost dreamlike or nightmarish at times. You know, you've got a young girl who sort of is sort of spoken to by a stranger, and then everybody thinks this stranger is sort of trying to kidnap her or abuse her, and this young girl is really confused. You've got people just in the strangest sort of predicaments, and there's a real sort of tongue-in-cheek sort of humour to this, that Samanta Schweblin's kind of laughing as she writes this, of these bizarre situations going on that kind of say a little bit about what's happening in the world, but also are just a kind of really playful, silly tale, but with something quite dark and quite serious behind them. So I really need to read some Samanta Schweblin because I think I would adore her work based on this, because even despite me always wanting a sort of longer form than short stories, I really found something quite enjoyable about how unsettling and how absurd some of these stories are, and that gives me a lot of hope for her other books as well. So yeah, really, really fun. And those have been the books I read this week. I hope you are keeping really well. I hope you've had a good reading week. And I will see you very, very soon. It is now jumper weather in the UK, finally, although it's sort of a bit sunny today, which is a good season. So there we go. I'll speak to you all soon. Take care and have a good week. Bye-bye.